So in this video, I'm actually going to be talking about Kubernetes multi-tenancy in a big enterprise. Usually a tenant is basically a team. So a big company has multiple teams. So each team can be considered as a tenant. And each team might have multiple services. Service 1, service 2, and service 3. Now I'm actually talking about Kubernetes terminology here, obviously. So these services are deployed in Kubernetes clusters, right? So you have a Kubernetes cluster, and then there are many ways to actually design this. Like for example, let's say each service has its own namespace. So like namespace 1 basically contains service 1, and namespace 2 contains service 2, and so on. Sometimes actually like one namespace could have multiple services, right? S3, S4 and all. So this is all up to the architects in the company, like how they want to actually design their application. Now why is this important? So obviously to access this cluster, this Kubernetes cluster, your team needs access. So we need to actually like have Kubernetes users, right? Users. So the team members are basically the users, and there is a certain way for creating Kubernetes users, and each user will have access to his or her own service actually, right? So for example, let's say there is a team called T1 which has a couple of services. So and then each service is running in their own namespace, and then so these are the services that are running in that namespace, and then users from this team or team members basically are the users, right? So there's going to be U1, U2, U3, etc. So now they need to have access to both of these namespaces, right? Let's say like they need to have access to all the resources in these namespaces, like pods, deployments, replica sets, volume mounts, persistent volumes, etc. So let's say these users need to have access to all those resources, and then in these namespaces. So in Kubernetes, traditionally the way it is achieved is by means of roles and role bindings. Now these are namespace scoped, right? And then you also have cluster role and cluster role binding. This is cluster scoped actually, so we're not going to go into that. So now what do I mean by namespace scoped? So what I mean by that is basically you can create a role in a namespace. So let's imagine a namespace NS1, and then in that actually you have a role, and then you have a Kubernetes user. Now there will be a role binding in this namespace, which basically binds this role to this user, right? And this role will basically dictate the kind of authorization this user gets. Basically, for example, let's say this user will get to have all the verbs, like all the actions, like create, delete, get, list, all those things on all the resources. So you can actually define that in the role, and then this role binding basically it ties the role with the user. Okay, so this is one way to do it. And then similarly, you might have a different namespace where you have a different role and role binding. And then if we need to provide access to this namespace to the same user, then basically we can bind this user to this role as well. So you can do that, right? So this is how, I think this is basically the traditional method. So there are like custom resource definitions, or kind of like third-party libraries now, there in the market. For example, I actually got to know of a software called Capsule. Now using this Capsule, we can manage all these things actually, right? So let's jump into the Capsule demo. So I'm actually like looking at this Capsule documentation, and it's got a bunch of tutorials. So if you want to install Capsule in your Kubernetes cluster, basically you can do it in a couple of ways. So you can actually just use this YAML file, this install.yaml file, and then you can do a kubectl apply, and that will install Capsule, which for some reason actually didn't work for me well. So I ended up following the second method, which is the Helm method. So I installed Helm. I didn't have Helm on my Kubernetes cluster, so I installed Helm, and then I just followed these instructions which I got from here. So I just clicked on this readme page and took me here, and I just followed these commands, basically these instructions, and ran these commands, and that basically installed the Capsule in my Kubernetes cluster. Okay, so once the installation is done, now you can actually try doing this demo that I'm going to show you. So the first thing that we're going to do is create tenants. So basically tenants are teams. Okay, it can be something different also, but for the sake of simplicity, let's just say that the tenants are teams. Okay, so now let's go ahead and create two teams. Okay, two tenants. The way you do it is by creating this resource called tenant. Okay, so right now there is a couple of tenants. Okay, so I created these tenants by using these YAML files. So let me show you the YAML file. You see over here. So I have a tenant for team 1, and user 1 and user 3 are owners of team 1. Okay, and let me actually show you the other tenant I have, which is team 2, and user 2 and user 4 are part of team 2. Okay, and they own this tenant. Okay, so now we have two tenants, and I used this shell script So this is a handy shell script that basically can be downloaded from the same Capsule documentation over here. I don't know how much you can see, so let me maximize this. So if you go to this one, this is the create-user.sh shell script. So if you use the script, you can create users in Kubernetes. Okay, all right. So using the script, actually I created a bunch of users. As you can see, user 1, user 3, user 2, user 4, and the shell script will create the private key and the certificate, and it will also generate a config file for each user, as you can see. So running this is pretty straightforward. You just run the shell script, and then in my case I put user 1 in place of Alice or Alice, and oil. So oil is the name of the team. Okay, so in my case it's tenant team 1. Okay, so I put user 1 in tenant team 1 as defined in my tenant YAML file, right? So that's what I did for user 1, user 2, user 3, user 4. So I have all the kubeconfig files that I need to do this demo. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is basically I'm going to just set this parameter called kubeconfig. Okay, and let me clear my screen a little bit, make the font a little bit more bigger. So we set this parameter. So now if I just do kubectl get namespace, so this user doesn't have access to the namespace resource, which is a cluster scoped object. So that makes sense, but this user can create a new namespace. So I have some commands recorded in my notes, so I'm just going to make use of that. As you can see, basically the commands that I ran, whatever I just explained. So I applied the tenant YAML files, which created the tenant, and then I ran the create user.sh script, and I did it for user 1, user 2, user 3, and user 4 as well. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a namespace as user 1, right? Because I'm using the kubeconfig file for user 1, right? So I'm going to create a namespace called team1 namespace 1, and in this namespace basically I can create resources, right? So you can see I'm creating a pod called pod1 in this team1 ns1 namespace, and that's based on nginx image, and that's successful. So let's keep going. So I'm going to switch to user 3, and how do I do that? I set the kubeconfig parameter again. I'm going to use this different kubeconfig file. So now can I view the pods in this different namespace? Now I'm actually working as user 3, right? So can I actually do this? And it's possible because user 1 and user 3 are part of team 1, right? Tenant team 1. So now I am actually going to create a namespace 2 in this team 1 namespace 2 as user 3, and I can also create another pod called pod 2 in this team 1 namespace 2. Okay, there you go. So you have that. So now if I switch to user 1 again by setting the kubeconfig parameter, I can basically view the object that is created in a different namespace, which is namespace 2, right? So as you can see, like how like this is done very easily. Like if you had to follow like the traditional creating roles and role bindings for each namespace, and then if you follow that method, it's going to be a little bit more tedious actually. So now this is achieved actually very easily. Okay, so you have these two namespaces which are belonging to team 1. Now let's actually do a few things for team 2 actually. So nothing different. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to change to user 2, and I'm going to create a different namespace as user 2, and I'm going to create another pod in that namespace, basically using the same Nginx image. And again, let's repeat the same for user 4, who is also an owner of team 2, tenant team 2, right? So let's go ahead and do that. Now I'm going to create another pod in this namespace, the second namespace in team 2. Okay, so that's all good. So now user 2 and user 4 are part of different team. User 1 and user 3 are part of team 1. So now right now the last kubeconfig setting shows that I am actually using this user 4 kubeconfig file, right? So as a user of team 2, can I actually see what objects were created by, for example, team 1 created by user 3 in team 1 ns1 namespace. Okay, so how do I do that? I can try to do a kubectl get pod -n, and let me put team 1 ns1. Obviously user 2 cannot access this namespace because that was created by a different team. And you can actually do the same thing as user 2. Even user 2 is not part of team 1, so basically he is not able to access that namespace either. But what if let's say I switch to user 1 kubeconfig, okay? And then if I try to access team 2's namespace as user 1, it's not possible because user 1 is not part of tenant team 2. Okay, so that's how we are isolating basically the tenants, like the workload of tenants, right? So if you go back to this documentation over here and look at this image, it clearly shows that like team 1, tenant A, or team 1 has a bunch of namespaces and they are isolated, and team 2 has a bunch of namespaces and they are isolated, and this guy cannot access this guy and this guy cannot access this guy. That's basically a short demo of what Capsule can do for you, and I hope that was useful. You can actually explore the other usages. I actually tried using Capsule instead of listing all the users. I tried to actually use this group kind. For some reason it didn't work. and I actually like encourage you guys to actually take that as homework and give it a try. And I'm going to stop here. I hope that was useful, and feel free to check out my Kubernetes playlist, and I'll see you guys in another video. Thank you.